What is going on, guys? In today's video I will show you the top 5 best bow builds in New World Aeternum that are optimized for both PvE and PvP. Also, as I will cover a lot of builds, so not to spend too much time, for each setup I will give you a quick overview of its playstyle. Then as well I will explain the best skill tree setup, then what gear should you wear, then even how many attributes should you allocate for each stat and much more. So, moving over to the first build, which is the bow and the musket. This setup is focused around dealing ranged DPS for both PvE and PvP. The objective of the build primarily is to annoy and deal free damage to the enemies from long range. Our bow will offer ranged AoE damage and mobility, while the musket brings strong single target pressure from a distance. You will want to swap between these two weapons, depending on what the situation calls for. However, as long as the enemy never gets too close to you, you will be dealing insane amount of damage. So let's take a look at the build. For our gear choice, we will go with the light armor, as this will give us maximum amount of damage and 2 really good dodge rolls. Since this build always wants to be at max range, so we are mainly concerned with damage over survivability. Next we have the attributes, and we want to get 25 strength, 350 dexterity, around 150 to 200 intelligence, and 100 constitution. Some players prefer to go even more extreme and don't spend any points in constitution. But my point of view is that you can't deal damage if you're dead, so getting 50 or 100 constitution is definitely worth it. Next up we have our setup for the bow. This layout is more focused around damage over time. As I've mentioned, our objective is to deal as much damage as possible from the range. And then again, this is how it should look like for the musket. The principle is very similar, just the musket will focus more on increasing single target damage over time. If you are interested in the best gear, perks, consumables and everything else, then keep watching until the end of the video. And overall, if you are looking for one of the highest DPS builds in the game, then here it is. Then for the next build we have the bow and the rapier. This setup is a high skilling option that offers some of the highest damage and mobility potential in the game. The key to this build is stacking high bursts of damage and using skills for insane amount of defensives that can also be turned offensively to attack or escape. Our setup will focus around using only the best skills that will allow us to evade the enemy while continuously dealing ranged damage with our bow skills. The bow is a great weapon, and we will increase its damage even further by increasing its AoE and explosive damage potential. As I've said, this build is not the easiest to play, so if you want a challenge, but at the same time be rewarded with a fun and powerful PvP performance, then this setup might be for you. So let's take a look at the build. For our gear choice, we will go with the light armor, as this will give us maximum damage and 2 really good dodge rolls. Since this build has already insane defensives from the rapier setup, so in return we can afford to go with the weakest category. Then next we have the attributes, and we want to get 25 strength, from 350 to 400 dexterity, then 150 intelligence, and finally 100 constitution. As I've mentioned, some players prefer to go even more extreme and don't spend any points in constitution, but I still prefer the extra HP for the hard bosses or if I ever get in trouble for being out of position in PvP. Next up we have our setup for the bow. This layout is more focused around damage over time. Also, as I've mentioned, our objective is to deal as much damage as possible from the range, so he will upgrade that aspect as much as we can. And then again, this is how it should look like for the rapier. So on the other hand, the rapier in this case is our primary defensive tool that we can use for mobility, and at any moment we can run away or perhaps run into another fleeing enemy. If you're interested in the best gear, perks, consumables and everything else, then keep watching until the end of the video. Overall, this build is very fun and strong, as most of our skill usage will be the difference between winning or losing a fight. So if you really want an in-depth playstyle, then I definitely recommend to try this build out. Next up we have the bow and spear. This is one of the most popular builds, as with this setup, you become an elusive ranged damage assassin, with an arsenal of tools to help you escape, while also bursting down enemies in few seconds. The bow by itself is incredibly strong in this game, but especially if you're a new player, then it will take time to get used to. And most importantly, you will need to hit your shots, otherwise you will lose out on DPS. So then this is where the spear comes into play, as we can use him to lock down our enemies and make them a very easy target. So let's take a look at our setup. For our gear choice, we will go with the light armor, as this will give us the maximum damage and 2 really good dodge rolls. Since this build always wants to be at max range and only go for the kill when locking down the enemy with our spear's crowd control, so this choice should be self-explanatory. Next we have the attributes, and we want to get 200 strength, then 350 dexterity, then 50 intelligence, and then also 25 in focus, and finally 50 constitution. I've allocated these attributes so we get insane damage. There's been done a bunch of testing, and it's been shown that for the spear and bow, it gives more damage if we go 200 strength and 350 in dexterity, rather than putting 550 only in dexterity, because of a thing called diminishing returns. And as the spear by itself also scales from strength, so these points will give us great CC and DPS at the same time. Next we have our skill tree for the bow. This layout is more focused around damage over time and AoV, so that's why we invest heavily into the poison smoke and rain of arrows. And then again, this is how it should look like for the spear. So this layout is structured around sweeping down the enemy and then doing quick bursts of damage while the target is immobilized. If you are interested in the best gear, perks, consumables and everything else, then keep watching until the end of the video. And overall, if you want to play one of the strongest solo player builds for both PvE and PvP, then here it is. Next we have a very fun build, which is the bow and the hatchet. This setup is known as the toxic arrow build, because we will utilize a lot of damage over time effects that will make our enemies take a lot of damage over a long period of time. This build is ideal for leveling and small scale PvP, as you get insane amount of mobility and damage, so you can easily hit enemies few times and then run around them while waiting for your cooldowns to come back up. So let's take a look at the setup. And for the weight, we can either way go with the light or medium armor. I personally prefer medium, as it allows me to stay closer to my enemies, especially in PvE. But if you want to use this build purely for PvP as a hit and run playstyle, then you can also sacrifice defense and go with full light armor and with maximum amount of dexterity. So while we are on this topic, let's take a look at our attributes. And we want to get 25 strength, 400 plus dexterity, 25 in focus and 200 constitution. As I've mentioned, I want to mix and match my survivability and damage, but if you purely want to go full DPS, then you can easily take 100 constitution and take dexterity all the way to 500. Then next we have our skill tree, and this is how it should look like for the bow. So we mainly focus all of our skills on easy to hit abilities, so we can damage multiple enemies at once. Also, we build to increase the duration and cooldown reduction as much as possible. And then next we have our hatchet, and this is how it should look like. So here we have the same thing, as we mainly build around poison and damage over time skills that we can also use from range, while still having the strongest skill in the game, the berserk mode. Overall, if you're looking for the best leveling and mob grinding build, then here you go. And then for the last and final one, we have the bow with the void gauntlet. This is by far the highest damage build for PvE. This setup is great for dealing damage over time in big clumps, as most of our skills are built around AoE debuffs, stuns and interrupts. Also, as we are going to be using Void Gauntlet with CC skills, so we will need to be relatively close to the enemy, which means not making ourselves very squishy. So then we can go in, lock down a target, then burst him down, and then come back and survive another day. So if this sounds fun, then let's take a look at the setup. And for our weight, we want to use the light armor, as this will give us incredible amount of damage while also giving us 2 dodge rolls, so we can quickly get in and out of fights. Then for the attributes, we want to get 25 strength, then from 350 to 400 dexterity, then also 150 intelligence, and finally 100 constitution. As we are using light armor, so to get some defense, so we for sure want to get the 100 constitution, just in case to be safe. Next, as far as our skill tree goes, this is how it should look like for the bow. So I've built around AoV damage and just burst DPS, so we can quickly melt down large groups of enemies. While then on the other hand, the Void Gauntlet is structured around increasing your damage and locking down any target that crosses your path. Just remember that you almost have 0 defenses, so using the 2 dodge rolls and positioning yourself will be quite crucial for your success. And then for the last and final part, let's take a look at the base gear, buffs and consumables that pretty much all builds could use. And remember that this is just an example. So as far as armor goes, of course slowly but surely, you want to get to 725 gear score. And no matter if you choose medium or light armor, always use the opal gem on your gear. And if you can, then try to get these perks like the health, enchanted ward and the freedom. Then as far as your weapons go, I really like to go with diamond gem on my bows and just general ranged weapons. And then for all of your melee weapons, use the opal gem. And for weapon perks, some really good ones that you should try to get is Keen, Vicious and Refreshing Move. And last but not least for your rune, always go with the Stalwart Heart rune of the Firestorm. And then for consumables, you should already know what to do. So use Honing Stones for damage increase, use Attribute Food for plus 40 attribute stats, and don't forget about healing and regen potions if you ever get in trouble. And that's about it. So if you enjoyed this video, click like, subscribe and comment. If you're interested in more content, then check out my channel, and I will see you in the next one. So take it easy, peace.